Hello and welcome to Presence of Mind. It's a webinar hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne and Gallery Lane Cove. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land from where this webinar is being hosted. I'd also like to acknowledge where I am, that's Arakwal country, Bundjalung country on the far north coast of New South Wales. And we have guests who are all over the country. So we'll hear from which countries they're coming to us to. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend my respect to any other blackfellows present. Now, Presence of Mind is a group exhibition that examines the varied ways that Buddhist practices inform the creative process and works of visual artists in Australia and Singapore. It's curated from the perspectives of two Buddhist practitioners, and the exhibition uncovers how elements of Buddhism permeate the practices of different artists from diverse backgrounds. Presence of Mind foregrounds the practice of mindfulness, increasingly adopted as a strategy to cope with the stresses of modern day life. Many contemporary secular techniques of mindfulness have been developed from traditional Buddhist meditation practices. For artists in this exhibition, in Presence of Mind, mindfulness is foundational to their creative processes and can take many forms, from embodied processes to playful humour, as well as technological and traditional motifs. In bringing together diasporic artists from Australia and Singapore, Presence of Mind examines intersections of Buddhist lived experience and cultural differences. In its totality, the residency and exhibition project highlights the rich perspectives that spirituality can bring to art. The exhibition is taking place at Gallery Lane Cove in Sydney until the 26th of February. Today, we are exploring the role of mindfulness in the creative process, and I'm delighted to be joined by four wonderful panellists. Kath Fries is a Sydney-based curator and artist. She's co-curator of the Presence of Mind exhibition. Kath's a visual artist, and her practice involves being attentive to embodied experiences, relationships, materiality, and ecological interdependencies. Ryuchi Fujimura is an independent dance artist based in Sydney. Since the mid-1990s, he studied contemporary dance technique, as well as improvisation and choreography in Australia and overseas. Jess Hewen is a Dharma teacher and writer, and she's been engaged in meditative and embodiment practices since the age of 17. She's trained in traditional monastic Buddhist settings, in interfaith contexts of meditative inquiry, and also within long periods of solitary forest practice. And last but not least, Associate Professor Nicholas van Dam. Nicholas is the inaugural director of the Contemplative Studies Centre and a senior lecturer in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Nicholas is committed to contemplative research and practice for the flourishing of humankind. What a panel. Now, could I begin with you, Nicholas, and ask each of our panel, to introduce yourselves in the way you'd like to be introduced? I mean, I've touched on your professional background and personal background, but please feel free to kind of inject something else into your welcome. Nicholas.
So I'm Nicholas van Dam. I'm originally from Wisconsin in the United States, which is I believe, Potawatomi country, Forest County, in that section of the US. Grew up there and moved to Melbourne about 4.5 years ago. I'm trained formally as a clinical psychologist and am a long-term practitioner on and off rather, in various forms of Buddhist-inspired meditation practices. My research spans a couple of different areas. So one of my main focuses on mental health issues, particularly related to anxiety, depression, substance use. I'm very interested in the concept of mindfulness, how we understand mindfulness, what it is, and meditative practices and what they can do for us, as well as things around decision-making, how we make choices and what that means.
Jess, perhaps? Jess, do you want to just give us a couple of words of introduction?
Sure, yeah, I'm pretty happy with your introduction there, but probably pertinent to this topic, just to say that that art and writing and then meditation have always been really braided together in my inquiry, and probably, yeah, things that sort of exploded in me when I was 17, and I've just kept pursuing in whatever way I can here in Australia and overseas, and following my instinct to sort of keep going with that.
Fabulous. Ryuchi, could you introduce yourself as you might like to be introduced?
Sure. Hi, I am Ryuchi Fujimura. I am originally from Japan, but now I'm participating in this discussion from a Gadigal country. I have a full disclosure. I am not a very mindful person.
You and me both. What a beautifully punctuated introduction. Yes, we'll get to that issue of mindfulness and how we practice it or don't practice it. Kath, a little bit from you, because you're the co-curator of the Presence of Mind exhibition, which pretty much underlies the conversation today.
Thanks, Daniel. Yes, well, I'm primarily an artist, and I find that mindfulness really kind of underpins my art practice and how I relate to working with materials and how I relate to the world. And I was very fortunate to study with Lindy Lee, who most people would know. And she was wonderful in helping me learn more about Buddhism and Buddhist philosophies. And I think learning more about those and practicing meditation with her, because she was my meditation teacher for quite a while as well. The Buddhist philosophies of interconnection and impermanence became very central to my work and the way that I work with materials and how they change in my sculptures and installations in space, indoors and outdoors. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also interested in as curator, co-curator of and artist in the Presence of Mind exhibition. How do meditative processes link the works in the exhibition? Well, I want to touch on those because I think evoking the visual in a conversation like this is a good mindful practice.
Yes, the artists have some really interesting ways of bringing elements of meditation and mindfulness into their processes. Some of them are more traditional or formal, and some are much more, I guess, sort of almost organic in the way of working with different materials. One of our artists, Lachlan Warner, he has created grave teacups, and he's dug soil and clay from cemeteries, from the new parts of cemeteries that don't have any bodies buried in them yet, but will in the future. And he's taken the clay from these cemeteries and worked through the clay to get it to a really good consistency and made pinch pot teacups, which is glazed. And in the exhibition, you're invited to pick up one of these teacups and hold it in your hands. And so you're holding a piece of clay from a cemetery. So you're like really physically connected to the cemetery, and you can take a teacup home. And the idea is also you could even drink from the teacup, and that connects you through this cycle of living and birth and death, and this sense that one day we're all going to die, and our bodies will return back to the earth and to the ground. So there's some wonderful I guess, mindfulness approaches to materials in quite a few of the works, and also to process, to being present and being in the present moment, which is very, very key to mindfulness.
At that point, I should just say welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us for this conversation. Please post your comments or questions, actually questions, please, in the Q&A section in the chat box. We'll endeavour to answer them, as many of them as we possibly can towards the end of this conversation. Sticking with that, with Kath and with the Presence of Mind exhibition, do you see the works in the exhibition? You know, you mentioned Lindy Lee, some of the other artists in the exhibition, yourself. Do the works kind of come out of the practice or experience of meditation, or is it less so? Is it a bit like Ryuchi saying, I'm not a mindful person, but the work may kind of inspire or evoke that kind of almost secondhand experience of meditation?
Look, I think it comes in at different levels in different people's practices. In a lot of ways, I guess, because all of the artists in the exhibition, because they're all Buddhist, there is quite a deep sense of meditation and mindfulness and Buddhism, and particularly kind of the ethics of Buddhism, being very embedded in how we live in every day, and how we sort of relate to the world and respond to the situations. And so that then becomes part of the artist's practices to extensively. It's been quite interesting talking to the artists about both their art practice and their Buddhist practices and their meditation practices. And generally they're all like, well, they're all very interconnected and they all inform each other and they don't really separate out in a neat way. You know, given that it's not that we're all experts at being mindful. It's definitely, it can be very challenging. We all get frustrated. We all get confronted by unexpected things that is not of our choosing, you know, and I think given the COVID situation and all of the unexpected things that keep happening and having to keep changing, and that really has brought to the foreground how we can be mindful in a lot of relationships and situations. So it's different in each case, but all the artists really do have a lot of meditation skills and mindfulness processes and how they work.
Ryuchi, you're an amazing choreographer and dancer. I want to talk about improvisation. A fundamental of improvisation is, you know, an awareness on many levels. And I guess that kind of awareness, being aware of every part of your body, every extremity, I mean, that could be considered to be a contemplative practice, a kind of form of mindfulness. Can you talk to us about your practice or lack thereof, and then perhaps discuss your process of improvisation?
Mm-hmm. So my dance practice includes contemporary dance, the body weather training, and sort of postmodern improvisational approaches. And as I said, I'm not very mindful. And when I was invited to this discussion, I knew so little about mindfulness. I had to watch quite a few YouTube videos, like Mindfulness for Dummies or Beginner's Meditation. Then, when I was learning about mindfulness, I realized the similarity between the meditation and dance, like focusing on breathing, body scanning, visualization, and extremely slow movement called bisoku in body weather practice. And also some of the mindfulness principle reminded me of the principle of dance improvisation. So those who are not familiar with the dance improvisation, it is the process of spontaneously creating movement, moment by moment. And in contemporary dance, dancers often improvise to find or generate movement as a tool for choreography, but some dancers improvise as a performance. And there are many different ways of improvising dance, and there's no established methodology. But so I have only studied dance improvisation with few teachers. But what's common with in their teaching is just constantly observe what's happening internally, your thought, emotion, and the sensation, and respond with no opinion. So I thought maybe that's similar to the essence of mindfulness or meditation.
I love that, respond with no opinion. In relation to your own practice, I mean, a really important part of performance, of dance, is that connection with the performance space and or with the audience. Does your response to what is around you change? You know, if there's a full house and you're in the open, does that change the way you kind of improvise?
I think it's influenced by many factors, and I think the presence of the audience is one of the major factors, but not necessarily the size of the audience. And this doesn't happen every time. It actually doesn't happen that often, but when the improvised performance is working, and I'm making air quote on working, this may sound corny, but I feel the flow of energy circulates between the audience and myself, or if I have a co-performance on stage between myself and them, and also the audience. It's like I am moved by the energy from the audience, or I'm moved by the architectural space. But as I say, it doesn't happen every time.
Yes, of course. I'm just thinking about that word flow, and in terms of, you know, my own yoga practice, which, you know, I finished many years ago, the idea of moving and keeping the flow and all the different poses was a really important mindfulness practice in my own life. Now, Jess, you're a meditation practitioner, a teacher and a writer. How do you describe your meditation practice, and how does it help or change the way you see the world? Because you spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Yeah. No, I spin out sometimes thinking, you know, the uncommon amount of time I've spent with my eyes closed. But I think initially, like I started practicing, it was to get me out of trouble. You know, it was to find some reference point in my own being deeper than the noise that was, you know, ramming through my mind. So it started very spontaneously, and it was just learning to really settle down and learning to settle back into my own skin and find some ease. And then, you know, and I kept on going with it. And then later I met the Buddha Dharma and those teachings, and they kind of mapped my practice deeper. And, you know, I sort of affirmed, they kind of matched my experience that, yes, there is something very regenerative and creative that we can get to by staying still and not giving up on ourselves too quickly, like staying to get to the goods. And so I suppose now, like from a classical, I'd sort of call it predominantly, it's a sort of a vipassana practice where you're learning to settle down. You're learning to be able to see your experience more fearlessly, to have space to see it, so you're not just jammed up against it. And that in that open space, it gives room for insight to come. You know, so in a sense, like mindfulness is not there just to learn how to move things around better or to look like you're really peaceful, but it's there to kind of set the conditions for insight and connection and love, and to break through sort of our resistances to be here more. So I get annoyed when it's all kind of put down to mindfulness as like a sort of appearance of being slow and steady. It's more alive than that. It's to support aliveness. And then I suppose, how does that make me respond to the world? As I get more comfortable in all my terrain, you know, like my anger or my frustration or my insecurity or my fragility or my wildness or my whatever, I'm more equipped to be able to stay steady with what the world brings to me and not run. You know, I'm more resourced to kind of meet the faces of life and all that moves through me and all of us, which is complex, you know, and intense at times. So, yeah.
And this whole, you know, in the current climate, the global climate, and I mean in the shadow of the pandemic, it's not true that we've had more time to be mindful. In fact, I would say that we haven't really had much time to be mindful. But you also kind of contradict this idea that, you know, meditation and mindfulness, if you want to call it that, there's this temptation to see it as checking out, or a way of kind of putting yourself, well, removing yourself from the world. It's not that at all in your experience.
No, yeah, I like how you say that. No, yeah. It's not fading out or getting away or getting out of, you know, and we all have probably known how we do that to escape our suffering. You know, you want to get the hell out because it's just too hard. You're more equipped to come in, you know, you're more equipped to actually go, no, to handle all of that complexity and the squeamishness and what's difficult, and to stay and to keep opening in the face of everything that would want to make us close, you know. So there's a sort of, there's something to do with the heart in a deep practice. Yeah.
I understand you also work and teach in theatre. Can you tell us about your process within that kind of theatrical space, and how contemplative practice might inform a performance?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit interesting. Like when you sit down to practice meditation, there's some commitment. You're not going to just get up and run away when it gets tough. You know? And then in a theatre, you're in a dark room and you have people for a certain amount of time where you can play and break through and interrogate kind of perceptions and stereotypes, or the first glance that you might have of someone. You have to stay with them for longer. And so in the theatre I'm working with for 10 years, actors with intellectual disabilities, then you have copped a lot of weird views on them, and have felt people, you know, move away from them, not a generous gaze. So in our process, really, we would just sit down together. I mean, we'd meditate, and then we'd dance, we'd get everything kind of open, and then we'd have a conversation. And in the contemplative space, one too quickly into any position, and giving room to be surprised by what's said, but also by what's not been said, and what's kind of flexing in the interior of the person, but hasn't been given the chance to kind of break through. So we'd start asking questions, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about loneliness? How do you feel about the room that you saw this morning, or the dream you had last night? And then we'll just keep going without stopping. And first you sort of get the cliches, and a lot of these actors were a bit used to fading out because they wasn't invited into the conversation enough. So you just keep asking questions. What do you feel about that? What do you feel about that? And then slowly something would start to emerge that was quite stunning, like the being would kind of come through, and you get through the cliche and you get something very interesting, and something that I think would start to really move the audiences and bring us into this deeper intimacy, where you just have to see someone deeper and be challenged by your first perceptions. Yeah.
While it's I'm muting myself because we're getting quite a downpour here on the far north coast of New South Wales, and yeah, I don't want, as beautiful as it sounds, the rain on the roof, I don't want it to be distracting. Now, Nicholas, can I move towards you? You're a meditation researcher, a psychologist, and the director of the Contemplative Studies Centre. Can you give us a kind of short introduction to some of the aims and the concerns of contemplative science, this thing we call contemplative science?
So the field of contemplative science sort of emerged as initially, I guess, as a dialogue between the sort of diversity of contemplative practices and scientific investigation or study. And so the focus is very specifically on contemplative practices because it's much broader than just mindfulness or meditation. We've heard all these wonderful examples already from our panelists about movement and theater and dancing and art, and all of these kinds of endeavors and things like prayer all fall under this umbrella of contemplative practices. And so the field as a whole, I think, is moving more and more towards thinking about this wide variety of practices, and then trying to understand, what do they do? How do they work? How do we understand what happens to people when they engage in these practices? And I think from my particular background, which is as a psychologist, ultimately for me, it's in thinking about how we generate best policies and how we generate sort of recommendations for people as they're engaging one-on-one with clients, say in psychotherapy. So we know how can these kinds of ideas, contemplative practices, sort of help people to live their best lives or live better lives, or to help them overcome issues that they may be experiencing. And none of it really is to stifle creativity or artistic endeavors or individual differences, but it's sort of to give those general guidelines and sort of ideas about, well, what do we know works? How does it work? And if we're going to train people to do these kinds of things and practices, what kind of general instructions ought we to give to those people? And that's not to say there won't always be individual differences or variations in what therapists or teachers or instructors do and how they teach what they do or how individuals practice. But it is to say that one of the goals is to kind of say, well, what are the things that on average sort of seem to work for people, that seem to help people, and how do we train people towards those things?
Just out of my own interest, what are the limits of contemplative studies or contemplative science? Are we talking about this may well be not just meditation, but religious practice, all kinds of religious practice where people are called on to be more contemplative in their lives?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's quite there's quite a challenge. I think many people within the field as well as outside of the field view contemplative science or contemplative practices as if there will somehow be some beautiful integration of religious practices or spiritual practices and science. Somehow we'll all get together and we'll agree on the explanation to all of what life is all about. We'll resolve all the disputes, all the disagreements, and that'll be it. Other people sort of come to it thinking, well, once and for all, science will show that all of the other stuff is not really necessary or is superfluous or whatever. And other people come to it from the other side going, well, the science will validate what we've believed all along, and it'll show us that there really is a God, or that we really can transcend this life. I don't think any of that is really true. And I think the field has really grappled with this. When Mind and Life, the organization that was founded by His Holiness with neuroscientist Francisco Varela, was founded, it was initially intended as a dialogue, as a true discussion. And it was meant to be like a debate, an engagement, a back and forth, where the contemplative practitioners, some of whom themselves were engaged in scientific sort of endeavors as well, and the scientists, many of whom were engaged in contemplative practices, could actually riff off of each other and could have discussions and could stretch their minds, but also kind of fundamentally and vehemently sometimes disagree with one another. And so I think the challenge is more in the former of what I said. The challenge is in that I think people think that this work will somehow resolve these discrepancies, when I don't think it actually resolves them. I think it just brings them to the fore of the conversation. And I think, going off of what Jess said, in some ways it allows us to be a little bit more comfortable with the discomfort that comes from disagreeing, and actually to try to sit with that and process that and think about, okay, well, what do we do next? We know we don't agree, but how do we hold that? How do we contain that? How do we still coexist? And what can we learn from each other, both as scientists and practitioners and artists and et cetera?
What are some of the ways you think that meditative traditions foster creativity from what you've been able to observe?
So, one particularly interesting thing is that, there's so many variations of meditative traditions, and different traditions obviously approach these things in different ways. We heard this sort of idea from Ryuchi about, kind of just the art or the activity of sort of, expressing words or sort of acting without an opinion. And that sort of, to me, echoes with kind of some of the Zen traditions, where you're sort of just trying to clear the mind, as it were, to sort of uncover some deeper nature that sort of may be existing underneath, and getting all of the kind of added baggage and stuff that's present on top, and kind of reading it to let yourself speak from kind of your deepest or truest nature. So there's these ideas sort of in certain veins or traditions within Zen of those kinds of ideas. Within other traditions, I think in the kind of meditation or mindfulness kind of secular Buddhist kind of practice that I typically do, there's more of an emphasis, I think, on letting go. And the idea being that you don't necessarily have, or you don't have to have strong preconceptions, or you can find a way around the preconceptions of what is the solution, or what is the thing that needs to be done. And you can actually come at what you perceive the problem to be, or what you perceive the task to be. So you're sitting in front of a canvas, or you're sitting in front of an audience, and you're prepared to engage with them. And you can kind of just let go of the idea that you have to solve that problem or address that canvas or engage with that audience in a particular way. And you can actually kind of take it all in. You can kind of go, okay, well, how am I feeling? What is this canvas saying to me? What is this audience saying to me? And I think more from rather than how do I react, like what is my natural instinct of what I ought to do? There are traditions that say, what do I want to do? What do I want to create? How do I want to engage with this audience here? And what kinds of elements of the scenario or the context in which I find myself do I want to draw upon in this particular moment? So I think there's this continuum along these practices where you can kind of go to a really instinctive, really kind of bare, like just respond or react from your gut, and sort of what's deeply there, truest and deepest in yourself, to this more, actually, I want to be more thoughtful and careful, and I want to decide for myself which elements I want to riff off of or work with. And I think within meditative traditions, there's that full gamut of possibilities.
Now, Kath, can we talk about I tend to think that, artists, people who are engaged in some kind of artistic practice, whether they be dancers or sculptors or photographers, there's a sense of, this whole thing about mindfulness being about being in the moment, about confronting something, or about being right there. And perhaps the artwork is the example of someone being right there at that time, the artist's hand, for example. But can you talk us through this connection to the materiality of the different media that you use, that you work with as a sculptor, and how mindfulness supports the work that you create?
Well, I work with a lot of natural materials. One material that I've been working with extensively recently has been mushrooms and mushroom mycelium. And I just find it so fascinating. And I do kind of completely nerd out on this. But there's something really intriguing about mushroom mycelium in the soil around us, connecting all the plants, and in forests, how the tree roots are all connected to each other and they can communicate through the mycelium and they can exchange water and nutrients and sugar. And there's something so beautiful about thinking of these ecological relationships as supporting each other rather than competitive. So there's quite a kind of, I think, flip in this way of individualist thinking that we sort of get pushed into. I guess you could say it's sort of mainstream culture, this sort of the individual. Whereas to think of the interdependencies and the reciprocal relationships between living things, I find very exciting. And just this notion of everything being very interconnected all the time, and we are very interconnected with our surroundings all the time. Even just breathing, you know, we're sharing the air around us with the space that we're in, and when we're outside, you know, we're sharing it with the plants, and we tend to overlook that. So there's something about the mushrooms and the mushroom mycelium that gets me very excited about interconnection, and also just the unknown is so great with mushrooms. They're so surprising when they like pop up in fruit. The mycelium's under the ground all the time. We just pretty much ignore it. And then surprisingly, these little mushrooms come up really fast, often just overnight. And they can be a little bit spooky, a little bit strange. They're really weird shapes. Some people think they're very alien. So I've been working with edible mushrooms, a lot of oyster mushrooms, and more recently reishi mushrooms, which are a medicinal mushroom. They're used in a tea. And I discovered after I'd started working with the reishi mushroom that some people were calling it the Zen mushroom, because when you drink the reishi tea, it calms your mind and body. So it's supposed to be very calming. And so I ended up using the reishi mushrooms in the work that I have in presence of mind. And I've grown these, I call them meditation mounds. They're little mounds of reishi mushrooms, and they're grown on a sawdust and wood chip substrate. So the mycelium kind of grows through into this shape, and then the mushrooms come out the side. And the reishi mushroom is quite amazing. It throws a lot of brown spore around, which kind of covers everything in this brown dust, which for me is always quite magical because I'm not sure when it's going to happen. I sort of I'm looking after them in the studio in this sort of makeshift greenhouse, trying to water them enough, get them enough light, get them enough airflow, and hoping that I'm taking enough care of them that they'll want to grow. And then one day I come in and suddenly there's mushrooms everywhere, or suddenly the mushrooms have thrown spore in all directions. And there's something very fabulous in this sort of co-creative way of working, and the unpredictability, and being open to not being 100% sure how the work is going to turn out. It's a bit of a gamble.
Well, so it's an organic practice. I mean, you can't really predict what's going to happen. And how does that kind of inhibit you as a creator?
To be honest, I don't find it that inhibiting. I find it more liberating. And I think that's probably, and that's the sort of one of the things that I find about working with these materials. I'm kind of letting them do their own thing. And I like the idea of allowing them to speak for themselves in a sense. I'm not trying to take them and turn them into something else that doesn't talk about where they came from or their origins or their interconnections in the world. But I'm trying to find ways of working with them in a kind of a relationship that speaks to their other relationships.
Mm-hmm. So the mycelium is that network, the unseen network, through which mushrooms come up through the surface. It's beneath our feet, essentially, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. I do some walking meditations as well, and I like to kind of visualize the mycelium network underfoot with each step that you take. It can kind of blow your mind in a kind of expansive, beautiful way.
And I think, I hate to hark on the pandemic, but that has also reminded me of how interconnected and interdependent we are, and how we we touch each other without even meaning to. And although, you know, there are so many negative consequences, I mean, it really reminded me of how utterly dependent we are on each other in some ways. And we are part of a network that's unseen, that's unacknowledged at times. So it's made me think very deeply about my relationship to other human beings.
I think that's quite wonderful too, things that prompt us to consider the unseen and the things that we tend to, you know, we know on some level, but really in our day-to-day life, we don't think about it at all. But actually it can be very enriching to take on more of the unseen, whether it's spiritual, metaphysical, or scientific or biological. I think it leads to a much sort of richer engagement with the world.
Ryuchi, I understand that the practices of no theatre encourage a kind of observing of your own performance from different angles, and, you know, triangulating or moving around yourself and seeing yourself as the performer. This has resonances, I think, with meditative practice. You know, how we observe our inner experience, or we confront what's going on inside. How does this process of performance support you in your work? And by that I mean, you know, this thing in no theatre to observe yourself from different angles.
So Zeami, the founder of No Theatre from the 14th to 15th century, developed a number of, I don't know what I should call, but technique or philosophy or discipline for no performers. But I find many of them are universally applicable and useful for performing artists in general, regardless of your discipline. And one of them is called Riken no Ken. And literally it's detached viewpoint. So in the body weather practice, we often place your eyes 1.5 meter away from yourself and trying to visualize yourself from right side, left side, front, back, below, above. So I think it's, in my interpretation, it's important for the performer to see their performance objectively, especially from the audience point of view, so that the performer can share the same experience with the audience. Personally, it's not the easy operation, especially in the improvised performance. As I said before, because my focus is quite internal. I'm trying to observe what's happening inside, but also you're trying to see yourself outside from your body. So some practitioners say, ideally place yourself not completely inside, not completely outside, somewhere in between. But from my experience, it's like I'm hopping from one viewpoint to another, so going back and forth.
I mean, it's a really interesting way of looking at a problem too. This idea that is reproduced in this principle in No, and that is, you know, look at the problem, put it in a box or surround it with glass, and then approach it from different angles. Like, what am I missing here? I also kind of use that approach in problem solving, but I didn't realize there was this beautiful resonance with the techniques of No theatre. Just moving over to you, can you describe the relationship between the discipline of meditation and the practice of improvisation in your writing and in your practice as a writer? How do you connect those two? How do you improvise when you write and still kind of carry over the discipline of meditation?
I think probably the meditation feels more of a discipline in a way than the writing, other than the writing's a discipline to keep doing it. But I think in a meditation practice, you're in a sense disrupting habit. Like, you are pausing for some moment and are willing to not keep doing what you've just been doing. You know, like you feel uncomfortable, you're not just going to go and grab the muffin, or you feel lonely, you're not just going to quickly call someone. Like, you're sort of disrupting what you would usually do, or even like following, say, you know, difficult thought patterns down dark lanes that maybe sometimes you just go easily down. You're kind of like watching this and stopping that habituation. And in that stopping, an energy starts building, a sort of focus of energy, because you're not leaking your energy down all these, habitual tendencies that give us pain or sort of dwarf us in some way. There's a sort of, in that it builds an energy. And in that, the unconscious and the conscious gets more porous. So like people on meditation retreats have the craziest dreams, like everything gets really more porous and free and dreamy. And in that, a lot of surprising and compelling and alive images start arising up out of that deep well. But it really takes time to get there. And there does need some discipline to dig down and stay in one place to sort of get to those waters. If we move around all the time, you sort of don't get that. And it's hard to stay, but I think it's worthwhile. But anyway, so that well, I suppose, delivers me images and stories that then I will just pour into in my writing. Like on a retreat, I used to leave an hour in the afternoon, even though I wasn't meant to, just to let my stories come. So I go silence. Okay, open floodgates. Now let them come. And the way my unconscious, or the way that, my inner life started to resolve itself with characters, then I just follow it. So a sort of withholding, a containing of energy, and then a just going with it and letting it stream, but from a deeper place was how I kind of see it.
Mm-hmm. How do you work when you say hit a wall with an artistic or meditative practice? How can you move past that kind of brick wall? I think many of us know what that is, to hit the wall.
Yeah.
How do you evolve and keep creating or meditating?
Yeah, like I was just thinking about this last night, because I literally actually did hit a wall once when I was working on a production with the Roller Coaster Theatre Company. Like actually, I was so willfully kind of directing the work because we didn't have much time, so I was getting really intense about it.
You physically hit the wall?
I physically smashed a wall. And then
Wow.
one of the actors, who happens to have Down syndrome, with the utmost kindness, I'd say, of a Buddha, took my hand. He said, "You're being a bit intense, Jess. You've got to relax." Took me into the toilet. He actually, cleaned my nose up. He said, "You and walls have got a problem," And then I, and all, when you start striving in your work and you're wanting it to be somewhere, and your kind of ego starts hijacking the process, and you lose the freshness of the creativity. So I think when we hit a wall, there's something about a softening, and sometimes we actually have to go another way. And it might be not doing something different, but a shift in perspective. Sometimes it's crying, sometimes it's going for a walk. Sometimes it's also just getting inspired to listen to someone that gives you sort of good juice again, and you get back on your track. But I definitely think it's sometimes when we hit a wall, sometimes our will's trying to get us somewhere, and there's another way we've got to go that's uncomfortable. But in that softening and taking a pause, something fresh will come in again. That's not just our doing. That is often got like some intelligence to it, and it's compelling. Yeah. So I think it's.
Kath, I might ask you that question. I mean, the kind of image, I guess, is a blank canvas of when you're confronted with something that you can't work with, or a piece of clay that doesn't want to work with you, or when you hit a wall creatively, or perhaps in relation to your meditation or meditative practice. How do you kind of move through?
Yeah, it can be really challenging and confronting. And often, or particularly with my meditative practice, I just hit walls fairly often, and have to say, and go, I'm still such a beginner at this. But I mean, there's a lot of, like, an easy answer for that is there's a lot of wonderful led meditations online that I find, if I find someone whose voice and tempo and way of taking you through a meditation, it suits me, then I find that very helpful. The other thing that I love doing for meditation is a walking meditation. And I find that they always work very well for me. You just get into this rhythm of slow walking, and your breathing is in the rhythm of your walking. And there is something in Thich Nhat Hanh has this, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk and teacher. He has this beautiful expression for walking meditations. He says your feet are kissing the ground with each step. So you're thinking about your connection with the earth, and that you're encountering the earth with gratitude and appreciation. And it is very much that sort of shift outside yourself in a way as well. So I find walking meditations can be really helpful for me. I guess in the studio, though, it can be very difficult when you hit a wall making work. And for me, it usually happens when there's a deadline. And I've, like Jess was saying, the ego really steps in. It's like that I want the work to achieve these things, and it has to be at this standard and it just isn't working. So often when I recognize that that's happening, and what, hopefully without trying to push on too much, I'll take a break and walk away, and just for an hour, or even come back the next day. And one of my tricks that I've developed over the years is to come to my work and try and bring fresh eyes to it and think, what would I think if this wasn't my work, if it was someone else's work? Would it be communicating something to me, or what would I see was lacking, or just try and take a different perspective on it? So yeah, that sort of try and step away from your ego just a little bit, and that can be very helpful.
Ryuchi, I'll ask you the same question. Have you had this experience of hitting a wall creatively, or in terms of a kind of mindfulness practice? How do you kind of transcend, or how do you get through those kind of that wall?
Yeah, that reminds me of this experience. Cass just say leaving your ego. So where this happened a long time ago, but I did a 10 minutes improv, and I wasn't very experienced as an improviser, but the performance was well received, and it's like the energy was circulating between the audience and myself. So the next time we performed, or I performed, like a few months later, because I received such a great feedback and response and applause that I think I was too keen to please the audience, and I was acting like a clown. So I wasn't observing myself, and I think my mind was focusing in 10 minutes later, the applause from the audience. So, and the performance is a complete failure. So, I get applause, like, obligatory applause. So I think since then, that experience taught me a lot, and it's just important just to go back and to pare down and just observe myself. No desire, no opinion.
I think we've all had experiences of the obligatory clap, just because people feel they have to congratulate you after you've done something. Nicholas, I've neglected you, but some practices might seek enlightenment or connection with a higher power. But these can be difficult to measure through any normal science, in inverted commas. How do you meditate? How do you mediate any tensions between the aims of contemplative science versus the aims of traditional practices, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably sort of two answers that I can think of off the top of my head to that question. One is, I don't know, maybe less satisfying, maybe more. But the first answer sort of is you don't. And I guess sort of the reason I think of that answer is that science is one way of looking at the world and one way of exploring the world and trying to understand the world. And whether we admit it or not, is essentially a belief system. That there's assumptions behind science and how we do it and what it means and how we arrive at conclusions and how we know what we know. And within many of these traditions, spiritual, practice-based or others, that may be a very different way of looking at the world. And so it may be that these two different ways of approaching the world and understanding it sometimes just don't match and don't get along. And it may be that people are practicing for reasons that have nothing to do with science, and they may have no interest in knowing what science has to say about that experience. And to me, and I think many in the area, that's totally cool. Like, that's fine. It's not that I have to explain what your experience is in order for it to be valid. Another answer, though, I guess, is that where we are trying to understand that, and where we are trying to broaden what it is that we can potentially understand, or what we do, or we're trying to better fit, I guess, what people's experiences are in day-to-day life with how we make sense of the world via a scientific frame, is, I guess, by having conversations like this, by rather than just focusing on speaking with more biologists or neuroscientists or psychologists and hearing what they have to say, we expand our circle. And that's one of the reasons why there are many dialogues, I think, in contemplative science, and why we make a real effort to engage with people from the arts and people from within the humanities, and people in religious studies as well, because when these kinds of discussions are had, you hear things, right? And you hear these sort of interesting ideas that have analogous themes with a particular principle in science. So, you know, when Kath was talking about the mycelium network, I started to think about, you know, dynamic systems theory. So that, you know, one particular version of that is, you know, chaos theory, right? Or when you were talking about how we were all connected, right? I was thinking of, well, you know, across the pandemic, a single ship getting stuck in a canal caused massive, you know, follow-on effects across the entire world. And so there are scientific frameworks and ideas and approaches that have evolved out of just having these kinds of conversations. And as a scientist, you go, oh, that's cool. You're talking about you know, Ryuchi was talking about an energy that comes out of interacting or engaging with the audience. And as a scientist, I then go, okay, well, what could I do differently to try to engage that or measure that or look at that? You know, what would I need to do to convince an objective, dyed in the wool, you know, rationalist, card-carrying scientist to say there might be something there? And so I think at the end of the day, there's a way in which, I mean, my position is, you know, I can never definitively prove that ideas like enlightenment exist or that God exists or doesn't exist, but I can expand the definitions and the ideas that we use in scientific terms to say maybe these things are possible. And what I personally try to do is be agnostic and truly agnostic and just open to the idea that these things are possible. And I try to sort of expand my toolkit a bit and say, okay, well, I'm not just going to scan the brain, or I'm not just going to measure physiology. I'm going to try to expand how I'm measuring what's possible in these types of experiences. So I'm going to think creatively. I'm going to ask people around the practitioner. I'm going to look at how they behave in the world. I'm going to, I don't know, but maybe put a canvas in front of them and sort of see what different people do with that canvas when I set up a particular configuration in an experiment. So I guess there's lots of ways. So those are my two answers.
Mm-hmm. Ryuchi, back to you. Art, broadly art, and in your case, you know, your work in dance, it can help us change the way we experience the world. But how do you think art helps us transform how we see and act in the world, that kind of sense of physical, how we move through the world? Big question, I know.
Yeah, I think that's $1 million question. As a practitioner, I encountered dance in my late 20s. So up until then, I had no exposure to art, let alone performing art. And then 6 months after I took on, started dance practice, many people commented that my posture changed. So I used to have a really hunched back, but now my posture is more upright, and therefore the gaze is open. So I think that helped me to see the world better, and that led me to performance and cultivate my interest in art. So I think what I want to say is that I went to the Presence of Mind exhibition on the opening day, and congratulations, Cass, that was amazing exhibition. And when I stopped to look at each artwork, I noticed some of the work caused me change my breathing patterns. Like I noticed myself breathing more deeply, slowly. So I think some artwork caused a physiological response that would influence the way we experience the world.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have experienced that quickening of heart. You know, when I see things as a visualist, I have had that experience of having my heart race by, you know, a natural landscape or something I see in a gallery, an artwork. Kath, would you say that kind of quickening of the heart, and this whole idea of how we position ourselves and how we move our bodies in a space, for example, in a gallery, it can be transformative. It can transform the way we see the world.
Yeah, it can be very transformative, I think, on that kind of personal embodied level, and also in how we think, because it can show you different perspectives and open up different ways of thinking. There's a lot of being able to, I guess, in a sense, tell stories, but in a different way from how we would use words. I think the way that art communicates can be very powerful because it's generally, you know, a non-verbal language, a non-verbal way of communicating. And yeah, a friend colleague said to me a couple of months ago that she really liked my work, and that it really kind of hit her somewhere between her gut and her heart. She had this very physical response to it, of being quite drawn to it, and finding something that's, you know, both emotional and physical and intellectual, that just kind of spoke to her in a way that she didn't really have words for. And I love that level. Like I guess also like what Nicholas was talking about earlier, there is so much that we don't know in the unknown, and to be able to encounter that and respond to it and engage with it in some way, I find that's a very exciting part of art, and how it can change people.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about and going back to this idea of walking meditation too, and walking out of the gallery and walking out of a confined space. I was on a pilgrimage through on Honshu towards the Pacific coastline in Japan, the Kumano Kodo. And I was raised a Catholic, but never, you know, neither of my parents were particularly religious. But on that journey, as I crossed that country, up those steps, that some of which are 1,000 years old and sacred in the Shinto and Buddhist traditions, I experienced walking as a spiritual practice. I started to think about what I was doing. I was also recording audio, and there's also this intersection too for me with this concept of deep listening, which is very much an indigenous concept, the Dadiri, it's called. And Miriam Rose Ungemeer Bauman, is an incredible proponent of this technique of just listening to everything. So when I go onto country and I'm recording sound, which I do in my job, that's where I kind of reach this mindfulness. I reach this, not enlightenment, I won't say that, but I become much more aware of what's going on and my place in the world. Is there anything that kind of correlates for you, Jess, in your practice of meditation? Is there something that gets you there very quickly?
Maybe definitely being out on country. Just being able to, I suppose, not have all that input coming in so strongly, so the senses can open. Yeah, I can settle back and just take in so much more. And maybe being out of sort of social exchanges where maybe you have to act a certain way, or there's some demand to respond, or, you know, be in any way a place where you can, there's nothing expected of you. You can sort of really be unproductive, and you're out of any agenda. Kind of like, I think everybody's kind of said that in that art making. You're out of any agenda, so you can really freely explore and then freely relate. You know, I'd sometimes go into solitude for a while so I could just get back into that space, you know, re-enchant my senses to be able to perceive. And, you know, I think it's no mistake that so many cultures, or contemplative cultures, kind of wanted us to be in nature, or wanted us, sort of asked us to practice again and again to keep forging that kind of re-enchanted connection to life that's beyond any ambition or agenda or our own desire. And that we have that movement to connect and to get naked with life, but equally we have a movement to cover up and run away. So we need practices or art making to keep kind of enacting and enact again those rituals that give us connection. It's not always just a given you're going to get it. You know, there's some protocols or discipline to ensure that you'll be more awake for that moment. Yeah, and a practice of discipline is to support those spontaneous connections. Yeah.
I mean, the one way I get there too is, aside from when I'm recording on country, listening deeply to the voice, listening to the timbre, listening to the tone, the subtle shifts in a voice, the subtle shifts in a, you know, when someone, you know, presses forward towards the mic or moves away, watching the body language and when I'm in the studio listening to these sounds, amazing things happen. I hear all this stuff that I wasn't attuned to when I was actually doing the recording in live. Kath, when you're working in the studio and creating your work, does your meditative practice change your creative decisions? And how do you know if things are working well or badly when that happens? But yeah, how does your meditative practice change or not your creative decisions as an artist?
I think there is something very pertinent about this process of listening. And I love that deep listening practice. And I have read and heard quite a lot about it, and feel that it resonates very strongly. Particularly obviously when you're on country and outside, but then because I have all these natural materials and bring so much into the studio of the outside, there is this sense of focus and of listening and play as well, and just seeing how things are in that moment, how my relationship is with them, the other relationships that are going on. And so I think it's a patience and a focus, but also a gentleness, like a not gripping things too tightly, of trying to hold things lightly. And, possibly this process, this practice could be put in a context that could be separated from meditation. But for me, they sit very closely together and they inform each other. And a lot of when I'm practicing meditation or reading about people teaching it, I feel like a lot of the structure and the thinking around it does inform how I work with myself and with materials and with this notion of being present and listening, the focus of mindfulness in the studio.
And listening to not being something always that you do with your ears. Listening is something that you can feel. It can be much more kind of sensory. Our bodies also
attunement.
Our bodies also listen. And sometimes I think there's other parts of my body which do a better job of listening than my ears. There's things that were designed for the listening. So listening is really core to my experience of what you might call mindfulness. Jess, how important is consistency of method for the way you come at your artistic and meditative practice? So consistency of method. We talked about discipline before, but consistency of method, how important is that for you?
I mean, I think for me, it's been quite essential to keep at it and to have some commitment and fidelity to it. And I think that's also been backed by tradition, and my teachers, they sort of have been on my case quite a lot. I was here a lot, then going back to India and coming back. And I think to keep landing ourselves back in that sane, open, sort of regenerative place is quite demanding. I don't think it's an easy thing to do, I think there's a lot that goes against us. I think the culture demands a speediness from us. And if we're going to get off that, there needs some agency to come back into a very open place, free of those demands to keep at it. So I think, and in that freedom that we can get at through the practice, then I think, we can really contribute in a surprising way, like that there is wisdom there that emerges through those open spaces that demand a fidelity and time to go there. Like you've got to keep going there to get to know something. But I suppose how we go there changes, so my practice has been steady, but what I'm doing in it can be very, very different. I learned as much being on the streets in New York kind of, and like wandering around for days and nights there, that I learned, having a year in solitude, in India or whatever. So I don't have a perception about where you're going to listen or where you're going to heal or where you're going to get your depth. I think that, but I do think the consistency of practice, you get a listening to know what you need to do next, what you need to follow. Yeah.
And what are those conditions that help you to practice? Might not necessarily be walking down a street in New York or being in a forest by yourself for a couple of years. What are those conditions that you think? What are those preconditions that you need in order to bring on this mindful state?
I definitely think you need some form of support, that you're not just on your own, that when we're all held tight in something, that will really help us to let go, And so I do think having friendships around that support you in your deepest orientation to life, that have kind of got your back, like good friends that will say, yeah, go there. For me, it's been teachers that I've sought out that have become friends that kind of, yeah, will look upon us with kind of kindness and interest and want us to keep growing, you know, not just to settle into places that we're comfortable. So I think in like a body of support that promotes a kindness and a compassion in the way we're also relating with ourselves. Because to go deeper in a contemplative practice takes some trust of not just staying as you know yourself. And we don't always let go. Like we can see so many of us at the moment are fixed to so many different ideas to secure ourselves and secure our position. But I think to let go of that so we can really listen to each other and keep talking, we need to have some level of safety to be able to open. So safety, kindness, support of friends. And sometimes just, you know, Zen traditions will just say, just do it. Don't think about it. Just keep doing it. And then eventually the deep will kind of come up and kiss you. You know, something deep will start talking to you because you're giving it time. But yeah, we all, I think, and another teacher, yeah. I think that's enough.
I was going to say that you know, perhaps, Kath, the mycelium is a form of like what I'm imagining in my mind is this kind of this support network. It's a bit like the mycelium.
Yes. I love that analogy. Yeah.
And encouraging a kind of safe environment where we can practice being mindful. Yeah, I did experience an incredible sense of calm and I don't want to sound like a tourist, Ryuchi, but when I was in Japan, I experienced extraordinary highs in my sense of spiritual awareness, and had a number of experiences there which I've never had anywhere in the world. I'm only saying that not because you're Japanese, but because there just seems to be there seemed to me to be in Japan an honoring or a privileging of this of being mindful. Bearing in mind, I was on a pilgrimage, and the other people I met on that trip were pilgrims who'd definitely taken their time away from the city to, you know, experience the Kumano. Yes, so Ryuchi, my question is not really a question; it's a statement. But you know, on the pilgrimage, have you heard of the Kumano?
Just vaguely, and I've never joined the pilgrimage, but I'd love to. So
yeah,
you can give me more details.
Oh, it was on the
once the border opens.
Yeah, once we were able to travel, but I never had thought of walking or, you know, aside from yoga and some exercise, I'd never actually thought of, you know, there are moments when the mind and the body just aren't in alignment. And I realized when I was about 40 that my mind and body had never worked together. So I'm interested in how, you know, the physical practice of dance, the physical side of it, and that awareness, that sense of attunement with what's going on in your body is mindful. I mean, do you spend much? So you said at the outset that you're not a very mindful person, but that seems to me to be that kind of difference between the body and the mind.
Yeah. Well, after learning a bit about mindfulness from YouTube video and reading some articles, I would definitely say dance is mindful practice.
And I also think, you know, when I was talking about Miriam Rose Bauman, the proponent of Dadiri, this idea of deep listening, you know, there are terms that we have in contemplative studies, like the term mindfulness, which practitioners of mindfulness don't use. So I wanted to I should have done this at the outset, but unpack that term mindfulness. Nicholas, you know, I mean, we talk mindfulness. Are we saying some kind of spiritual practice? It includes meditation, but mindfulness is the word that seems to have the most cachet at the moment. Mindfulness, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's obviously one of the questions that probably get asked most often, and yet I always find it one of the hardest questions to answer. And I think that's just because nobody really agrees. You know, there are definitions that get used as kind of heuristics, if you will, that sort of make it easy for people to understand. It has all these kind of connotations or associations. You know, people tend to think of mindfulness as being present, being calm, being focused. There are all these ideas that that kind of come along with mindfulness. There's a lot of baggage, if you will. And it's for that reason I often, in my scientific work, have often said, can we stop using the term? Because there are too many extra additional things that people think this means that it may not. I mean, so the most common definition that sort of people, I guess, throw out there is one that sort of was offered by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and that's the one I think that permeates sort of popular culture. And this is this idea of paying attention in a very particular way. So you're integrating your attention and your awareness. You're doing it in a way that's non-judgmental. It's present-centered, and sort of it's open. It's curious. But the root of the word mindfulness, where it comes from in Buddhism, the Pali term sati, there's different interpretations of that, and there is this connotation that certain scholars speak to of memory, and in particular recalling an intention. So when Jess was talking about setting the conditions for practice, there's an element of sati that sort of is, to my mind and to my read, of recalling your intention or your commitment to do something, remembering to be engaged, remembering to be with what is, remembering to listen. So it doesn't necessarily even need to be present-centered. It doesn't need to be non-judgmental. I much prefer the term discerning, which is to say, it's not that you don't judge, or it's not that you don't say things are good or bad. It's actually discerning. You can differentiate those things that might be helpful from those things that aren't. And I think that's much more useful than non-judgmental. I think some people really need that term non-judgmental because to them, all they do is judge themselves and others. And so for them, it goes like, just stop doing that. And Kabat-Zinn says, don't even judge the judging. And I think that's very helpful for people as a frame. But as you progress, I think you need something more like discernment. You need to know that there are some things that you do that are helpful for you, and there's things that you do that aren't helpful for you. And in your practice and in your life, you remember your intention to kind of work out which things are which. So I don't know if I answered your question, I think, but hopefully I've given some sense of what we mean when we talk about mindfulness and what it is and where it comes from. One more thing I will say is, I think it's always bizarre to me, sort of, that mindfulness is the term of choice that got picked. It obviously comes from sort of largely Buddhism and Buddhist ideas, and the Noble Eightfold Path in particular, which is this way that you kind of, this idea that you commit to, or this way in which you live your life. And there's lots of different elements of the Noble Eightfold Path. So why this one element, or this one idea of mindfulness, is the thing that we've all grabbed onto, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think it maybe has the most cultural cachet, and it's the term that was the least predefined, if you will. There's concentration, and there's other where I feel like people already think they know what concentration is, or they already think they know what intention is. So maybe mindfulness was the term that was most ripe for redefining. But it sort of feels like, it was sort of just kind of grabbed as something that could, and Kabat-Zinn even says, more recently that, than to what he historically said, that it's meant to be an umbrella term. Like, it's meant to hold all of these things. It's not just meant to be a single thing. It's meant to be a placeholder for the entire commitment to a path or a way of life.
And that's why I think it kind of works. Mindfulness. It's such a big term, and can range across a lot of practices that are contemplative or meditative or religious even.
But it makes for confusing conversation.
It does.
When we're not necessarily talking about the same things, even though we think we are.
But I think, like the average person would come to the word mindful and go, oh, I understand what that means. Full mind full. I'm thinking about what's going on around me. I'm engaged with the world in a way that perhaps I'm not usually. I actually tend to think of mindfulness as being a much, rather than being this kind of calm, enlightened a moment in time. I'm often thinking that when I'm mindful, I'm at my most heightened and most aware, and it can be sometimes a little stressful. Do you ever have that experience, in your own practice, of this sense of everything being bigger and broader and much more? There's a sense of chaos in that as well. It's integrating it and going, well, that's how it is.
Yeah, I really do. I do, because I think it's more like our practice is allowing us to be able to open to more and more of our human experience and find at least some steadiness there. to be able to handle the complexity rather than move away from it. So it's like, yeah, people, it's peace, but it's not a peace that's immune from the suffering or the intensity or whatever is around us. So it's peace, and that is, I think that's elegant, like a peace that can also open to complexity. It's not moving away or hiding away. It's like steady, and it's seeing everything, and it's still staying open. And sometimes that's riding the edge of extreme pain, in the body or the heart, or sometimes that's opening to like a really wide sense of self beyond your own skin, where actually you're opening to relate with more and more of the cosmos. And that takes something from you too. That's not always comfortable to let yourself stretch that wide, and to not freak out. So I really agree. It's like the mindfulness is staying alert to what is without moving away. And that's not easy, because we will all move away from something when it starts to feel hot. Often there's like a very deep internal, the Buddha really kind of tracked this, where we want to run away, or we want to just fade out. We want to go, that's not really happening, Yeah, we tune out, or we run away, or we want to run after something and like grasp something really tight. These ways to handle our insecurity. So just to stay open with what is, even if it's uncomfortable, I think sets us up quite beautifully for a very real relationship to life.
Now, I reckon there are a lot of students in the audience today, Kath, Jess, Ryuchi, Nicholas. If you could give them one piece of final advice, I mean, we'll hopefully get some questions in the chat box. It's looking a little bit quiet at the moment, but if there's one piece of advice you could give one of the students from the Centre for Contemplative Studies, Kath or Jess, what would be a piece of advice that you would give someone who's embarking on a deeper knowledge, or embedding themselves in this terrain?
I think giving it time and being patient with yourself is quite important. It's not a fast track. It's, for most people, it's quite a lifelong pursuit. The meditation and mindfulness, and being able to listen more deeply and slow down and be more present with what's happening. But also, it doesn't have to be extremely serious. It can be very playful. The curiosity of opening up and of being open to what's going on can be very playful and fun, and there's a lot of joy in it as well. It's not super serious all the time.
Ryuchi, any advice for students?
Well, I am the beginner mindfulness student myself, so I'm not in a position, but may I say, just dance, even if you have no place but your living room. I'm stealing from Bajrama's Sanskrit, so sorry.
I don't care. It's brilliant advice. It's the best advice. Nicholas, any advice for the students?
I think one thing that kind of always comes back to me since sort of I really threw myself into various sort of Dharma meditation books was something that Thich Nhat Hanh said, and I'll paraphrase, but he said essentially that our ideas of happiness get in the way of us actually being happy. And I think that, to me, is just something that always comes back over and over to me again, is that the stories we tell ourselves and our ideas about how things should be and how we ought to be can be the very thing that is getting in the way of us achieving that which we most want to, or how we most want to feel. And so one of the things I think that we have to work at really hard is just to leave the stories aside and get out of our way, and to expand our ideas of, well, what might happiness, or what might joy, or what might success, what might that look like? And just be open to the possibilities. The thing you most want may be right in front of you. And it's just that you have some idea of what it is, and so you're missing that thing in front of you.
It's good advice. Jess, what would you say to a student?
Well, I'm loving what everybody else is saying. That's nice. I think there is some passion involved. I think there is sort of, for me, I was probably called to it in a bit of an extreme way, that I don't think it's like that for everyone. But I think when you do stop and you go, I'm here for this one life, I'm in this skin, I'm in this body, I'm working with this mind, this is predominantly what I'm seeing everything out of. how do I want to make a home here for myself, you know, and how do I want to allow what's creative in me to really have room to come through, and to preference that, like to put that as something, to value that. And like I said, you go to Japan where there's a spiritual culture. I went to India because it's so valued. You walk down the street, you see people like lit up with their yearning to connect deeper to life, to each other, to bust through this apathy or the way we dull ourselves to try to cope. But just that there's other means, and to get the support, and to then to be able to follow what's going to bring you to life, true to your own nature, and sort of seek that out. That there does need to be, I think in these times, some passion and some orientation to what's important, because that will get covered over very quickly.
Yeah, I love that. We do need more passion. And I do think, you know, sometimes when we talk about art making, I often think it's become so despiritualized. And I had this, you know, experience, I don't want to say transcendental experience, but when I saw the work of Hilma af Klint at the Art Gallery in New South Wales, the Swedish spiritualist, if you want to call her that, who spent a lot of time communing with spirits in a world that, you know, she experienced with other women in Sweden in the early 20th century. These extraordinary visions of emotion, of sensation, of, you know, I thought, you know, it's such a despiritualized world sometimes, the contemporary visual art world, I mean. Kath, do you have any pearls of wisdom around, you know, or just something to say about that, the kind of sense of the spirituality being evacuated from contemporary art? I often despair at how there's no space left for it.
It can be a difficult one. I think it can almost feel like it's safer not to go into spirituality in art, when really I think it's actually one of the most exciting ways to approach it. People who are asking the big, deep questions, or at least kind of have them in their life in some way.
Reaching,
yes.
Reaching for it, yeah.
Yes, reaching for it. So I'm really interested in those practices. And sometimes, there is a lot in the contemporary art world that can be quite cold and removed, and I'll use the word disconnected even. So, but I suppose it's also kind of what you're looking for, isn't it? There's just so much out there. And if you are looking for works that do kind of speak to your heart as well as your mind, that you have that deeper response to, and they're definitely out there, that it just takes a little bit of looking. And there's a whole lot of them at Gallery Lane Cove at the moment in the Presence of Mind exhibition, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And on until the 26th of February. I mean, that's really the kind of germ from which this conversation springs, is the artwork in the Presence of Mind exhibition, which is co-curated by Dr. Freeze. Dr. Freeze, a question from the audience for you, actually. And this is from Siobhan. I don't know where Siobhan is. Let's just say she's in Warrandyte. Dr. Freeze, do the mushrooms remain alive when exhibited? How do you consider their life-death impacts on your practice? It's an interesting one.
The life cycles of the mushrooms are quite interesting, because the fruiting bodies of the mushrooms, that what we would call the mushroom that comes out, they don't stay alive for very long. They die and they dry out. Depending on the conditions, they might go moldy and slimy, which is always fun when that happens in the gallery. That kind of freaks people out a bit. Some of my works, I'll have several flushes of mushrooms. So there'll be like 3 or 4 of mushrooms popping out and then dying back, and then some new ones will come up around them. So I love that that's this sort of engagement in the cycle of life, and you get to see this sort of journey in the artwork. I also use a lot of works where I've grown them in the studio and then dried them out, so that they're relatively stable in the gallery, and the mushrooms are dried and they're basically dead. They're not going to grow anymore. And they're such beautiful forms, and for me, I feel like they tell the story of their life and their interconnection and what they mean in the world, even though they're not actually growing or decaying in that particular moment. So Yeah, there's a mixture. Sometimes I have growing mushrooms in galleries, depending on the conditions, and they need quite a lot of light actually, so that doesn't always work. And watering, and yeah, they're quite fussy.
They do need a lot of attention.
Yes, they do.
Another question from Fiona. I'm going to put this to whoever wants to answer it. It's a little. It requires. There's several clauses. Okay, so here, go with me. Thanks so much for this fascinating discussion. You've talked about the potential of mindfulness presence to transform the artist. You also touched on the potential of art itself to transform others, for example, the audience. Do you see the second as being dependent on the first? So the potential of art to transform others, is it dependent on the mindfulness or presence and the transformation that happens with the artist? And if not, how do you view the link between these two aspects of transformative experience? I guess the artist has to have been transformed by mindfulness, or it has to be obvious in the work. And then, you know, it also has this potential to transform the audience. But I think there are artists who make work and have no idea of its potential for transformation. It's a tricky one. And what do you think? I'll read it again and it's in the chat box, but it is a little bit tricky. You've talked about the potential of mindfulness or presence to transform the artist. You also touched on the potential of art itself to transform others, the audience. Do you see the second as being dependent on the first? It's like a really tricky essay question.
Yeah.
HSC exam question.
Yeah, I'll try and jump in there. Look, I think sometimes artists will work in very concentrated and focused ways that they wouldn't necessarily term mindfulness or meditative. But there can be a very kind of intense focus and understanding of what they're doing and making that resonates through the work. And the viewer, the audience member, really feels that and is impacted by that.
It's osmotic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, just like that. So I think that, you know, there's all sorts of potential. Like once an artwork is made and it's out in the world, then there is still the relationship between the artwork and the artist, but the relationship between the viewer or the audience member and the artwork is just as important. And you can take whatever you want from that and read into it however you wish. But there can be, I really loved how Ryuchi talked about the energy flow. There can be this really powerful energy flow from when the artwork was made, and then when you're viewing it as an audience member, you can also be part of this energy flow, and it can have a huge impact on you. But whether it's exactly what the artist intended or not, isn't always necessarily the point.
Absolutely. Jess from Anon, Anon, hi Anon, how are you going? What are some ways to deal with the difficulties, the highs and lows, the boredom that can come in meditative and creative practices? We'll finish up after this question for you, Jess. Some of the ways to deal with the difficulties, the highs, the lows, the boredom that can come in meditative and creative practices.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's just inevitable that it's very real that we're going to be connected and then sometimes really not connected. And it sort of echoes back to what we all spoke about earlier, but just to keep staying with it and to know that this experience I'm having right now is not final. You know, that this experience that I'm having now is not a full stop. It always has possibility to move. Because often when we're in, like when our head's against the wall, somewhere there'll be that sneaky feeling to it's never going to end. You know, we really don't believe that could change. So it is some faith that like life is much more fluid than how this one moment right now appears. So just kind of knowing that can free it up. And boredom can be really interesting too. Like you can start to get sensitive to what is boredom, because we're all kind of running away from boredom. You know, we've got to get exciting and keep at it and keep interesting and keep on, you know. But once in my practice, I just said to myself, you know, because I'd been kind of wild as a teenager and really out there, and then I went through a really different period. I'm going to let myself be a totally boring, non-interesting, weirdo person for a while with no expectation. And then that got really interesting, you know. So to also use our creativity to turn things on their head and embrace what we would usually run from, So even being interested in boredom and inactivity and not abandoning that too quickly to want to be somewhere else. So opening the heart, staying to wherever we find ourselves, because mindfulness really easily also translates at heartfulness. And I've seen that in the Chinese tradition. Mindful equals heartful. So it's not just the mind. It's not this head on top of everything. We've got to get down and engage the heart. And then it gets broader and softer, and there's more tickling, there's something, that can help move that experience to something else. So to stay with it, drop into the heart, get out of the head.
Yeah, love that. Well, that's it. So thank you to our 4 panelists, Jess Hewen, Ryuchi Fujimura, Kath Fries, and Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. And thank you to the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, and also to Gallery Lane Cove, where until February the 26th, as I mentioned, you can see the Presence of Mind exhibition, which very much underlines the conversation we've had today. Most importantly, thank you to you. Thanks for tuning in, and wish you all the very best for your day.